It was a warm Saturday night, and a group of college friends had gathered for a casual hangout at Nora's apartment. The night was meant for a simple celebration, one last gathering before the semester really got underway. They had pizza, soda, and a deck of cards, but it wasn't long before boredom crept in. That was when Sam, always the risk-taker, pulled out a small wooden board with letters, numbers, and the words yes, no, and goodbye painted in eerie, faded letters. "A Ouija board?" Nora asked, eyeing it with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Why not?" Sam shrugged, grinning. "Come on, it's just for fun. Besides, don't you want to see if anyone wants to chat?" The others laughed nervously, but one by one, they agreed. They dimmed the lights and sat in a circle around the board, fingers lightly resting on the planchette. "All right, let's get started," Sam said, almost too eager. They began with the standard questions. "Is anyone here with us?" And "Can you hear us?" For a while, nothing happened. Just silence and the occasional snicker from one of the friends. But then, as the clock neared midnight, the planchette started to move. Slowly at first, then with surprising force. It circled around the board before stopping on yes. The group looked at each other with wide eyes, not sure if one of them was moving it or if something else was. Nervous laughter filled the room, but curiosity won over. They pressed on. "What's your name?" Sam asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The planchette spelled out Daniel. They each took turns asking questions, growing bolder with every answer. But as the questions became more personal, the tone of the responses seemed to shift, from friendly to almost invasive. "Do you want something from us?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette slid to yes. The room fell silent, a heavy sense of dread settling over them. They didn't want to keep going, but they also didn't want to end the session without saying goodbye. Sam, determined to lighten the mood, asked, "What do you want from us, Daniel?" The planchette began moving more erratically, spelling out words none of them could have predicted. BLOOD. Nervous laughter filled the room, but it was forced and tinged with fear. "Let's end this," Nora said quickly. She moved the planchette to goodbye and let out a shaky breath as she glanced at her friends. They all nodded, pretending to be relieved, but the air in the room had changed. It felt colder, thicker. They decided to leave the board alone and moved on to other activities, trying to forget the unsettling experience. But as the night went on, strange things began to happen. The lights would flicker, and they all heard faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. At first, they brushed it off, blaming it on Nora's old apartment. But when Sam's phone suddenly shut off and refused to turn back on, unease settled in again. One by one, they decided to leave, laughing it off as just an odd experience. Sam was the last to go. As he walked out the door, he noticed something in the hallway mirror, a reflection. Someone standing behind him, watching. But when he turned around, there was no one there. He shuddered, muttering under his breath, and hurried out, eager to shake off the strange energy. Over the next few days, each of them began to experience disturbing occurrences. Sam heard tapping on his bedroom window each night, even though his room was on the 3rd floor. Nora would wake up to find her closet door wide open, no matter how many times she shut it before bed. Their other friends reported cold drafts, the sensation of being watched, and inexplicable bruises appearing on their skin. It wasn't long before they started talking to each other, sharing these experiences, and realizing they all felt the same eerie presence. The sensation that Daniel had followed them home was undeniable. They decided to research the name, hoping it would lead them to answers, or at least some way to make the disturbances stop. After hours of digging through local history, they discovered a tragic story from the late 1800s about a young man named Daniel who had been murdered by his brother. The murder had occurred on the exact plot of land where Nora's apartment building now stood. The brother, who was known to be obsessed with the occult, had allegedly summoned Daniel's spirit after killing him, only to vanish shortly after. The group was horrified. They began to believe that their Ouija session had reawakened Daniel's spirit, and now he was trapped, growing angrier with each passing day. They reached out to a medium who had been recommended by one of their friends, hoping she could help them put Daniel to rest. The medium agreed to help, though she warned them that closing the doorway they'd opened wouldn't be easy. She arrived that evening, setting up candles and incense around the board, which Sam had kept despite everyone else's protests. She instructed them to sit in a circle, placing their hands on the planchette once more. "Daniel," she began, her voice firm, "we're here to help you move on. Show us what you need." The planchette moved immediately, faster than it ever had before, spelling out FEAR. Everyone froze, a collective chill sweeping over them. The medium took a deep breath, her face etched with concentration. "Why fear? What do you want?" The planchette continued, "N-O Dawo." The candles flickered, casting ominous shadows across the room. A deep, guttural moan seemed to resonate from somewhere beneath them, as if it was coming from the very foundation of the building. "Now?" Nora stammered, looking around, the panic clear on her face. "Now what?" Without warning, the planchette spelled out, DIE. The lights went out, plunging them into darkness. A chilling wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles. They sat frozen, hands trembling on the board, too afraid to move. A sudden, cold hand gripped Sam's shoulder, causing him to scream and stumble backward. In the faint glow of the streetlights streaming through the window, they saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner, barely more than a silhouette, but unmistakably watching them. The medium's voice cut through the darkness. "Daniel, release them. Go back where you belong." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering as if it was struggling to remain visible. A haunting wail filled the room, and the shadow stretched, growing taller, darker, until it seemed to consume all the light around it. With a final, desperate cry, the medium forced her hand on the planchette, dragging it to goodbye with all her might. The figure seemed to shudder, its outline blurring before it vanished entirely, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. The lights flickered back on, and they sat in shocked silence, barely able to process what had happened. They didn't speak of that night again, but each of them knew they'd be forever haunted by the memory, and by the figure they'd seen, a figure that seemed to embody fear itself. None of them ever touched a Ouija board again, and though they tried to move on, each knew that the experience had left a mark on them, a shadow lingering in the darkest corners of their minds, waiting, watching, never truly gone. Late one stormy night, a group of friends gathered in an old, creaky house in the middle of the woods, drawn together by the thrill of the unknown. They'd spent the day exploring abandoned sites around town, but this house, rumored to be haunted, was their final destination. It was supposed to be their bravest feat yet. As thunder cracked in the distance, one of them, Emma, produced an old Ouija board she'd found in a dusty corner of her attic. "It was just sitting there, waiting for us," she said with a mischievous grin. The board was weathered with faded letters and strange symbols none of them had seen before. Her friends exchanged hesitant glances, and though a few protested, curiosity got the better of them. They sat in a circle, setting the board between them, and placed their fingers lightly on the planchette. "Let's keep it quick," Adam muttered, glancing around at the shadowed corners of the room. It was only meant to be a joke, a way to spook each other out. But as they began, the air in the room grew heavier, colder. They called out the usual questions, hoping for a laugh, but their laughter faded when the planchette began to move on its own. It circled slowly before spelling out, HELP. "Who are you?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. A moment passed, and then, SEE. "See? See what?" she pressed, her fingers beginning to tremble. Instead of spelling out another word, the planchette began sliding in a circular motion, as if stirring up something in the room. Suddenly, a loud thud sounded from the corner of the room. Everyone froze, eyes darting to the shadows, but they saw nothing, just darkness pooling in the corner, where the light from the lamp didn't quite reach. "Let's stop," Adam whispered, but as he tried to lift his fingers, the planchette seemed to pull him back, almost forcing him to keep going. The board then spelled out, DOOR. "What door?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Almost on cue, there was a groan from the house as if it were breathing, and then a loud creak echoed from upstairs. The friends exchanged worried glances. None of them had explored the second floor yet. It had been blocked by an old door covered in chains and thick layers of dust. They thought it hadn't been opened in years. "We have to see," Emma said, though her voice betrayed her fear. Adam and the others protested, but she was already standing, her mind made up. Against their better judgment, they followed her to the foot of the stairs, staring up at the door in question. As they approached, the door creaked open, just a crack, though no one touched it. The air seeping from the darkened stairway smelled of rot and decay, as though something had been trapped there, festering for years. Despite their fear, curiosity pulled them in, and they slowly climbed the stairs. When they reached the top, they saw that the chains on the door had fallen loose, lying scattered across the floor. With a shared look of dread, Emma reached out and pushed the door fully open. The room beyond was dark and cold, with walls covered in peeling wallpaper and strange symbols scrawled in faded, rust-colored stains. The floor was littered with broken furniture and what looked like old, brittle bones. What is this?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she took a cautious step inside. She could feel an oppressive energy closing in around her, thickening the air. The others were rooted to the spot, too terrified to follow. Emma, however, was drawn to something on the floor, a small, old notebook lying open, as if waiting for her. She picked it up, her fingers grazing the brittle pages. The words scrawled inside were barely legible, written in a desperate, shaky hand. It spoke of an entity that had been summoned by accident, a spirit that demanded to be fed, to be appeased. "It's hungry," she murmured aloud, reading a line that was underlined repeatedly, almost gouging the page. "It's always hungry." A scratching noise suddenly came from beneath the floor, like claws scraping against the wood. Her friends backed away, their faces pale, whispering for her to leave the room, but Emma was transfixed. The scratching grew louder, frantic, as though something was trying to claw its way out. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, sealing them in. Emma dropped the notebook, stumbling back toward her friends. A cold breeze whipped through the room, though there were no windows open, and the air filled with an unsettling smell, something decayed and old, almost tangible in its foulness. Then a low whisper echoed from the walls, a voice they couldn't quite understand, but it seemed to call their names one by one in a chilling, drawn-out rasp. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows that twisted and elongated, taking on the shape of something sinister. In a single terrifying moment, they saw a figure appear in the corner of the room, a dark shape with long clawed fingers and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through them. "Run!" Adam shouted, but the door wouldn't budge. They banged on it, screamed, but it was as though the house itself had sealed them in. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. It raised a hand, and the friends felt an icy grip around their necks, a suffocating pressure that tightened with every breath. Panic surged through them as they struggled against the invisible hold. Emma, in a desperate attempt, pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure's face, a face twisted in agony, with hollow, sunken eyes and a mouth that seemed stretched too wide, as if frozen in an eternal scream. "We have to say goodbye!" Emma choked, managing to free her hand enough to grab the planchette from her pocket. With trembling fingers, she forced it over to "Goodbye" on the board she'd brought with her. The moment the planchette landed on "Goodbye," the figure stopped, freezing in place. The icy grip around their necks released, and they collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The house fell silent once more, and the oppressive darkness lifted. They scrambled to their feet, shoving and clawing at the door until it finally gave way, allowing them to stumble back down the stairs and out into the rain-drenched night. Outside, they huddled together, too shaken to speak, glancing back at the house that loomed silently in the darkness. No one dared to say a word as they got into their cars and sped away, vowing never to return. In the days that followed, they tried to move on, but each of them was haunted by nightmares where that dark figure stood at the foot of their bed, whispering in that same rasping voice, calling their names. And though they tried to forget, tried to convince themselves it was over, each of them could still hear that scratching beneath the floor, growing louder, as if something was still trying to claw its way out. On a quiet Saturday night, two friends, Leah and Sarah, decided to try out an old Ouija board they'd found while exploring an antique shop. They were alone in Leah's apartment, which had a slightly eerie atmosphere with its dim lights and old-fashioned decor. Sarah was hesitant at first, but Leah managed to convince her. It was supposed to be a fun, spooky way to spend the night, but neither of them realized how deeply disturbing things would soon become. They sat across from each other on the living room floor, dimming the lights to set the mood. Leah placed her fingers lightly on the planchette, and with a nervous glance at Sarah, she whispered, "Is there anyone here who wants to communicate with us?" For a few moments, nothing happened, and they both relaxed, thinking it was just a silly game. But suddenly, the planchette began to move, dragging their fingers with it. "Are you doing that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I swear," Leah replied, her eyes wide with fear. The planchette slid across the board, spelling out, "YS." They both froze, exchanging fearful glances, but Leah urged them to keep going. "What's your name?" she asked shakily. The planchette paused, then moved again. "ISAAC." They felt a chill settle over the room, as if someone were watching them. Sarah wanted to stop, but Leah, fueled by curiosity, continued. "Isaac, why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The response was chilling. "HIDING. Hiding? Hiding from what?" Sarah whispered, almost afraid of the answer. The planchette moved once more, faster this time, spelling out THEM. Neither of them knew what that meant, but the thought of something sinister chasing this spirit sent shivers down their spines. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and both girls began to see their breath in the cold air. The lights dimmed even further, and they could feel a strange pressure in the room as though they weren't alone. Without warning, the planchette jerked across the board, spelling out LEAVE. A loud, echoing knock came from the wall behind them. They both jumped, their hearts racing as they turned around, but there was no one there. The knock came again, louder this time, and then something began scratching at the wall. Leah was about to say something, but before she could, the Ouija board spelled out THEYFOUDM, me. In a panic, Sarah yanked her fingers off the planchette, but Leah grabbed her hand. "We need to say goodbye. We have to close the session," Leah insisted, her voice filled with desperation. But before they could, the planchette moved by itself, sliding back and forth between letters, spelling out something incoherent. Then, slowly, it spelled out two final words, HELPM, me. The scratching on the walls grew more frantic, like nails raking against wood, growing louder and louder. A faint whisper filled the room, indistinct at first, but growing clearer. It was a pleading, desperate voice that repeated over and over, "Help me! Help me!" The lights flickered violently, casting strange shadows across the walls. In one corner, they saw something dark and twisted. A figure crouched low, with hollow eyes that glinted in the faint light, watching them. Its mouth was twisted into a hideous grin, revealing teeth far too sharp, and it seemed to be laughing without sound, its shoulders shaking in eerie silence. Leah and Sarah scrambled to their feet, knocking the board over as they backed away. But the creature seemed to move with them, crawling forward in a jerky, unnatural manner. Its voice filled their minds, a voice neither human nor animal, and it echoed with an unending, hollow laugh. "Run!" Leah screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the front door. They sprinted down the hall, throwing the door open and fleeing into the night. Behind them, they could still hear the scratching, now coming from within the walls of the apartment itself, as though whatever they had summoned was now embedded within the very structure. When they reached the safety of the street, they looked back at the dark window of Leah's apartment. For a moment, they saw a figure standing there, watching them with hollow eyes and that same twisted grin. Then, it was gone, leaving nothing but darkness behind. They never returned to the apartment, leaving everything behind, including the Ouija board. But sometimes late at night, they both swear they can still hear that voice in their heads, whispering for help, scratching, scratching, scratching. In the late hours of a quiet autumn night, 4 college friends gathered in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation for being haunted. Locals swore they'd heard strange sounds coming from it in the dead of night, and some claimed they'd seen lights flickering in its broken windows. Naturally, this made it the perfect spot for a spooky night with a Ouija board. When they entered the house, the air was thick with dust, and the creaking floorboards seemed to echo in the empty rooms. They found a small, cold room upstairs to set up, placing the Ouija board on an old, splintered table. Laughter broke the silence as they tried to shake off their nerves, but deep down, each of them felt an uneasiness gnawing at them. They all placed their fingers on the planchette, and after a few moments of hesitation, Carly, the most skeptical of the group, began with the usual question, her voice wavering a bit. "Is there anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened, and they laughed in relief, feeling silly. But as they started joking, the planchette suddenly moved, slowly gliding over to yes! They all went quiet, exchanging wary looks. Who are you? Carly asked, her tone growing serious. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out a single word, watching. The friends glanced around as if expecting to see something in the shadows. That's creepy, Tom muttered. Maybe it's time to leave? But curiosity kept them glued to their spots. They continued. Carly asked, what do you want? After a pause, the planchette spelled out S-T-A-Y. Stay? Anna repeated nervously. Why? The board answered slowly, almost as if savoring each letter, L-O-N-I-N-G. A chill settled over them as the planchette moved again, this time quicker, almost frantically. I am L-O-N-E-L-Y. Suddenly, a door on the other side of the room slammed shut, making them all jump. Anna shrieked, and they looked at each other, wide-eyed with terror. Who's doing that? Mark asked, his voice trembling. But they all knew none of them had moved. The air around them felt heavier, colder, and they could almost hear a faint whisper in the room, like a breath too close for comfort. Maybe we should leave now, Anna suggested, glancing nervously at the door. But as she tried to get up, the planchette seemed to pull her fingers back down, refusing to let her go. Their hearts pounded as the board began to spell out another message. H-E-A-R-M-E. Carly swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. Hear you? What do you mean? The reply was immediate. P-L-E-A-S-E-H-E-L-M-E. Tom's hands shook. This isn't funny anymore. We're done. He tried to lift his fingers off the planchette, but a powerful chill froze him in place, and the board spelled out a final chilling message. D-O-N-G-O. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, although all the windows were closed. The candle they'd placed nearby flickered and then extinguished, plunging them into complete darkness. In the silence, they heard the creak of footsteps coming from the hallway, slow and heavy, as though something were approaching the room. They huddled together, holding their breath, too terrified to move. The footsteps grew louder, and with each step the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them with a suffocating weight. Then the footsteps stopped, just outside the door. Silence stretched, tense and terrifying. In the faint moonlight filtering through a crack in the boarded-up window, they saw a shadow shift under the door. Something was standing on the other side, waiting. Their instinct to run finally overcame their fear, and they bolted for the door. But as they reached it, the doorknob turned on its own, the door creaking open, just a crack. Peering out, they saw the darkened hallway stretching endlessly before them, as if the house itself had changed. They ran, not daring to look back, but as they raced down the stairs, they felt an icy, invisible hand graze their shoulders, tugging at their clothes, their hair, almost as if it were trying to pull them back. Desperation pushed them faster, and they finally burst out of the front door into the cold night air. Gasping, they looked back at the house, its broken windows dark and silent as if nothing had happened. But in one of the upstairs windows, they saw a faint silhouette, a figure standing there, watching them with hollow eyes. It lifted a hand, pressing it against the glass, and then slowly faded into the shadows. They fled the property, vowing never to return. But in the days that followed, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. At night, they'd catch glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of their vision, always there, always watching. And every so often they'd hear faint whispers, begging for help, filling their minds with a sorrowful plea that echoed endlessly. Don't go, please, don't leave me. On a dark, rainy night, 3 friends, Ella, Marcus, and Jade, gathered at Jade's family cabin in the woods. The cabin was a cozy old place nestled far from the nearest town, perfect for an autumn getaway. With the storm rattling the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, they decided to pass the time by trying out an antique Ouija board that Jade had found in the attic. They set the board on the small coffee table in the living room, lighting a few candles to add a spooky touch. At first, they were laughing, nudging each other and cracking jokes about what they might encounter. But as the storm intensified, their laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence as they placed their fingers on the planchette. Ella took a deep breath and spoke first. Is anyone here with us? For a moment, there was nothing, just the rain pattering against the windows. Then slowly, the planchette began to move, spelling out, Y-E-S. A chill swept through the room, and Marcus looked at the others with a nervous grin. Okay, which one of you is messing with us? Jade shook her head, her face pale. I'm not doing anything, she whispered. Ella felt a shiver run down her spine, but pressed on. What is your name? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette spelled out a name none of them recognized, A-L-I-L-E-C. They exchanged puzzled glances, feeling the weight of the silence deepen around them. What do you want? Ella asked, her hand shaking slightly as the rain began to pound harder against the cabin's roof. The planchette moved swiftly, almost impatiently, spelling out two words, H-E-L-P-M-E. They all looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The mood in the room had shifted, and the shadows cast by the candlelight seemed to stretch, looming over them. Help you? Jade asked, voice trembling. What do you need help with? The board responded immediately, spelling out a single, chilling word. R-U-N. Run? From what? Marcus asked, his voice a nervous tremor. The rain outside turned to a downpour, hammering against the roof, and a strange, cold draft swept through the cabin, despite the doors and windows being tightly shut. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. They all jumped, their eyes darting to the staircase that led to the second floor. Maybe it's just the storm? Marcus suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. But before they could say anything else, the planchette began to move on its own, faster than before, spelling out another message in frantic haste. A-E-L-I-V-E-S-U-P-S-T-A-I-R-S. They all froze, staring at the board in horror. Jade's face went white as she remembered something her grandmother had told her about the cabin years ago, that it was rumored to be haunted by a man who had once lived there alone, a man who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Just then, another loud thud sounded from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps moving slowly across the floor above them. Each step was slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something was pacing back and forth. Ella's eyes widened in terror. This isn't funny anymore. We should leave. But as they tried to lift their hands from the planchette, they felt a strange, cold pressure keeping their fingers in place, refusing to let them go. The board spelled out one final message, each letter appearing with a terrifying urgency. H-E-I-S-C-O-M-I-N. Without warning, the lights in the cabin flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the flickering candles, casting eerie shadows across the room. The footsteps above grew louder, moving toward the staircase, and then began descending, each step echoing in the silence. Terrified, they finally managed to pull their hands away from the board, stumbling over each other as they scrambled for the door. They threw it open and ran out into the rain, not daring to look back. Behind them, through the cabin's front window, they saw a dark figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching them with hollow, empty eyes. They didn't stop running until they were deep in the woods, soaking wet and shivering, with the rain pouring down around them. When they finally dared to look back, the cabin stood silently in the distance, its windows dark. But for a fleeting moment, they thought they saw a faint light flicker in the upstairs window, and the shadow of a figure passing by. In the days that followed, each of them felt a strange presence haunting them. They'd catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, hear footsteps in empty rooms, and feel cold breath on their necks when they were alone. It was as though something from that cabin had followed them, a presence they could never fully escape. And every night without fail, they'd hear a faint whisper just before they fell asleep. He lives. Upstairs. The last time Clara's family tried to contact the dead was on a windy October night that no one in town forgot. She was 15 then, skeptical but curious. Roped into a Ouija board session her older sister Marie insisted would change everything. Their house was an old Victorian with creaky floors, the kind of place where shadows always seemed to stretch too far, and Clara had always felt something watching her in that house, especially in the basement. Marie had set up the board there right in the middle of the cold cement floor. Clara didn't want to go down at first, feeling an eerie weight in her gut, but her sister's excitement and her pride drove her down the narrow, dimly lit stairs. They sat cross-legged around the board, joined by two of Marie's friends. The dim light from a single bulb cast dark, jagged shadows across their faces, and the walls felt like they were pressing in. The chill was biting, and Clara felt goosebumps crawl up her arms as they placed their fingers on the planchette. Marie smirked, trying to hide her own nerves. "All right, let's get this started. If anyone is here with us, show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. They all glanced at each other, rolling their eyes, but then Clara noticed her breath was visible in the chilly air, though the others' breaths weren't. Just as she was about to say something, the planchette moved, gliding across the board to yes. The basement seemed to grow even colder, and Clara could feel a strange energy around her, heavy and dark. Marie looked thrilled, thinking it was a prank. She asked, "What's your name?" The board began to spell out letters quickly. Lucas. Clara's stomach dropped. That was her father's name. He had passed away when she was just a baby. Her mom rarely spoke about him, and her sister never brought him up. A nervous laugh escaped Marie's friend, assuming it was a trick, but Clara felt dread creeping up her spine. "Lucas." Marie's voice trembled, though she tried to keep her composure. Are you trying to tell us something?" The planchette didn't move. Silence pressed down on them, the only sound the faint hum of the basement light bulb. Clara's hands shook, and she was about to pull them off the board when it finally started moving again, faster this time. "Doyut." Clara's heart pounded. Marie laughed it off, but Clara could see the fear in her sister's eyes. Just then, the basement light flickered, casting the room into brief moments of complete darkness. Clara could swear she heard footsteps above them, pacing back and forth, though she knew everyone else was asleep upstairs. Marie, ignoring the unease in her own voice, asked, "Why should we get out? Are you angry?" The planchette stilled, and Clara noticed the air around them felt thick and cold, like stepping into an ice-cold lake. Then, the board spelled out another message, chilling and deliberate. DEATH. Marie's friends started to panic, suggesting they stop, but Marie insisted they stay, saying they were probably just getting to the good part. But Clara's fear was now a gnawing certainty, a primal sense that something was terribly wrong. She could feel an almost physical presence pressing in on her, like unseen eyes drilling into her skin. Suddenly, the light bulb shattered, plunging them into darkness. The only sound was the ragged breathing of her sister's friends and the eerie hum of silence that seemed to buzz louder and louder in her ears. Clara fumbled for her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, when she saw something that made her freeze. In the corner of the room, just barely visible in the faint light from her phone screen, was a shadowy figure, too tall to be any of them, standing perfectly still. Its head tilted slightly, as though observing them. Clara felt its cold gaze pierce right through her, locking her in place. "Marie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's someone here." Her sister, now genuinely terrified, fumbled to turn on her phone light, but the figure was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of movement in the shadows. They all bolted up the stairs, leaving the Ouija board behind, slamming the basement door shut. As they caught their breath, they could still feel that cold presence, as though it had followed them up from the depths. They tried to laugh it off, to shake the feeling, but all four felt a lingering chill in their bones, a dread that didn't seem to leave. That night, Clara woke up to the sound of faint scratching coming from beneath her bed. Too terrified to look, she lay still, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder, more insistent, almost like fingers clawing against the wood. In the morning, Clara checked the basement. The board lay in pieces as though someone or something had torn it apart, and carved into the cement floor, as if by an invisible hand, was a single word: "Run." Over the years, Clara tried to forget that night, but the presence never left. Sometimes she'd feel it in the corner of her room, watching. Other nights she'd wake to the sound of scratching beneath her bed, and every so often in the dead of night she'd hear a faint whisper by her ear, cold and breathless, repeating the same warning: "Get out!" It was supposed to be just another sleepover for Mia, Jenny, and Sasha. They had set up sleeping bags in Mia's living room, surrounded by junk food, scary movies, and a Ouija board Mia had found in her parents' closet. The air was chilly, but they had dimmed the lights to add to the spooky atmosphere, giggling about the stories they were planning to share. After a few hours of ghost stories and snacks, Mia dared the others to try the Ouija board. "Come on," she teased. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jenny hesitated, but Sasha, ever the brave one, shrugged it off. "Let's do it," she grinned, placing her hands on the planchette. Mia and Jenny joined in, and Mia asked the first question: "Is there anyone here with us?" For a moment, nothing happened, and they began to relax. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move, sliding toward yes. They exchanged glances, nervously laughing, each assuming one of the others was pushing it. "Who are you?" Mia asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. The planchette paused and then spelled out a name they didn't recognize. Collin. A chill ran through the room, and Mia's playful smile faded. None of them knew anyone named Colin, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Colin, Sasha asked cautiously, how did you die? The planchette darted across the board as if something was in a rush to answer, spelling out two chilling words, Themirror. They all looked at each other, confused. Jenny's voice wavered as she asked, what do you mean, the mirror? The board spelled out a single word, Look. The girls turned their heads, realizing Mia's living room had a large, antique mirror on the far wall. It was old, with dark wood carvings around the edges, and looked as if it had been there forever. Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted, feeling colder, darker. Sasha, always the skeptic, stood up and walked toward the mirror. See, there's nothing here, she said, tapping the glass. But as her hand left the surface, the mirror began to fog up, as if someone were breathing on the other side. A message slowly appeared, written in the condensation. Help me, they gasped, backing away from the mirror. Just then, the lights in the room flickered and a faint whisper echoed through the room. It sounded like a young boy's voice filled with desperation. Help me. Let me out. Jenny, pale with terror, grabbed Mia's arm. Let's stop, please. I don't like this. But before they could even stand up, the planchette moved violently on its own, spelling out another message on the board, faster and faster. Too late. Too late. Too late. The lights went out and the room plunged into darkness. Mia fumbled for her phone's flashlight, and when she managed to turn it on, the beam of light reflected back from the mirror where they saw the faint outline of a figure, a young boy with hollow eyes staring out at them from the other side of the glass. In a shaky voice, Mia asked, Colin, are you trapped? The figure's lips didn't move, but they heard his voice again, faint and echoing through the room. Yes, he put me here. Who did? Sasha whispered, her voice barely audible. The mirror fogged again, and another message appeared. I am. As the words appeared, a dark, shadowy figure began to materialize behind the boy in the mirror, a tall, menacing shape with long, bony fingers and hollow, empty eyes. The boy's expression twisted into one of pure terror as he tried to mouth something to them, his hands pressing against the inside of the glass, pounding desperately. Without warning, the shadowed figure grabbed the boy by the shoulders and yanked him backward, dragging him into darkness. The mirror's surface went blank, the fog disappearing, leaving only their terrified reflections staring back at them. The girls bolted up, rushing to turn on every light in the house. They shut the Ouija board back in its box and tried to convince themselves that it was just a nightmare, a prank they'd all imagined together. But for the rest of the night, every mirror they passed seemed to shimmer with a faint fog, as though something or someone was waiting on the other side, trapped, desperate to escape. And when Mia went to put the Ouija board back in the closet the next morning, she found something that hadn't been there before. Carved into the back of the board, as though by a sharp, desperate hand, was a single word. Help! It was a crisp autumn evening when Mark and his friends decided to explore the old house on Elm Street. The place had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in mystery and whispered about for its dark past. Locals claimed the house was cursed. Stories floated around of disappearances, strange lights in the windows, and ghostly figures seen moving through the dusty rooms. Mark wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but his friends had dared him to check it out with them, so he couldn't back down. They arrived at the house just after sunset, armed with flashlights and their phones, feeling a thrill of nervous excitement. The house loomed over them, its wooden structure groaning with age. The windows were dark, and a chilly wind blew through the overgrown yard, rustling the dead leaves at their feet. As they stepped inside, the floorboards creaked ominously. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like the smell of old blood. They tried to laugh it off, teasing each other to mask their nerves, but each of them felt the unshakable sense that they weren't alone. Mark led the way, shining his flashlight through the dusty hallway. Faded portraits lined the walls, faces long forgotten, their eyes seeming to follow them as they walked. The deeper they ventured into the house, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. In one of the rooms, they found an old mirror, its surface clouded with dust. One of Mark's friends, Jake, wiped it clean with his sleeve, joking about how they might see a ghost's reflection. But as the dust cleared, they all froze. In the reflection, they could see themselves, but something was off. Behind them, just over Mark's shoulder, stood a figure cloaked in darkness, with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was twisted into a grotesque smile, its mouth stretched impossibly wide. But when they turned around, the room was empty. Nothing was there. Heart racing, Mark glanced back at the mirror, only to see the figure still there, grinning, now closer. "Let's get out of here," whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. But as they tried to leave, they found the door they'd entered through was now shut tight, as though it had been locked from the outside. The temperature dropped sharply, and their breath misted in the frigid air. Then they heard it, a faint, slow whisper, almost a laugh, echoing through the hallway. They backed away, but the laughter grew louder, filling the house with a low, menacing rumble. The flashlight beams flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. A sudden loud bang made them all jump, and they turned to see a figure moving at the end of the hallway, creeping toward them. It was the same figure from the mirror, only now it was real, its eyes hollow and its smile too wide, as if it had been carved into its face. Panicking, they stumbled backward, desperately searching for a way out. Mark's heart pounded as he spotted a staircase and led the way, hoping there might be another exit on the upper floor. They ran up the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing like a drumbeat. But as they reached the top, they realized with horror that the figure had somehow followed them, now at the bottom of the stairs, slowly ascending, one step at a time. Desperately, they ducked into the first room they saw, a bedroom with torn wallpaper and a broken window. They barricaded the door with a heavy dresser, panting, trying to stay silent, but they could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Jake shone his flashlight around, his hands shaking, and that's when they saw it, the writing on the walls, scrawled in a dark, dried substance that looked disturbingly like blood. "Leave me here. Join me here." A sudden knock on the door made them jump, and the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a whisper, as if someone were just outside the door, inches from them. "You're already mine." The room's light flickered violently, and in that split second, they saw him. The figure, standing inside the room, directly in front of them, closer than they'd realized. His hollow eyes bore into them, his twisted smile wide with malice. They screamed, backing away, and Mark stumbled, falling against the broken window. The glass shattered, cutting into his hands, but he didn't care. His only thought was escape. With a burst of adrenaline, he climbed through the broken window frame, feeling the shards tear at his skin, and jumped, crashing into the bushes below. The pain was sharp, but he forced himself to stand, glancing back at the house. He could see his friends at the window, their pale faces peering down, but something was wrong. They looked still, too still, and then he realized with horror that they weren't looking at him. They were staring past him, their expressions frozen in fear. Slowly, he turned around. The figure was standing right behind him, its face inches from his, its hollow eyes staring deep into his own. Mark felt his body go numb as a cold hand reached out, fingers grazing his face. Everything went black. When Mark awoke, he was alone, lying in a bed of dead leaves at the edge of the property. The house loomed in the distance, silent, dark, as if nothing had happened. But his friends were nowhere to be found. Panicking, he called out, his voice hoarse and trembling, but there was no answer. He stumbled back to town, covered in cuts and bruises, mumbling about the house and the figure, but no one believed him. The police searched the house, but they found no trace of his friends. The townspeople whispered, saying they'd simply vanished like all the others who had dared enter that cursed place. Mark moved away from town after that, haunted by memories he could never shake. And sometimes, late at night, he'd catch glimpses of hollow eyes watching him from the dark corners of his room, accompanied by a whisper that made his blood run cold. "You're already mine."